In the spring of 1915, the world stood balanced on the edge of catastrophe. Less than a year had passed since the outbreak of the First World War, yet Europe was already drenched in blood, fear, and uncertainty. Trenches scarred the landscape from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Empires strained under the weight of mobilization, and the rules that had governed warfare for centuries were rapidly collapsing. The oceans, once symbols of freedom, commerce, and connection, had become silent battlegrounds where death could strike without warning. It was in this atmosphere of escalating tension that the RMS Lusitania, one of the most famous passenger liners ever built, prepared for what would become her final voyage. Launched in 1906 by the Cunard Line, the Lusitania was more than a ship. She was a technological marvel and a floating emblem of British power. At over 31,000 tons and capable of speeds exceeding 25 knots, she was among the fastest vessels in the world. Her interiors rivaled the finest hotels of Europe, and her reputation for safety and luxury attracted wealthy elites, artists, families, and transatlantic travelers from every corner of society. To the public, the Lusitania represented progress and security. To military planners, however, she represented something far more complex. When war erupted in August 1914, Britain moved swiftly to use its greatest advantage: naval supremacy. The Royal Navy imposed a tight blockade on Germany, restricting the flow of food, fuel, and raw materials. The objective was clear: starve the German war machine into submission without risking massive naval battles. The blockade was devastatingly effective, but it also pushed Germany toward desperation. Unable to challenge Britain's surface fleet directly, Germany turned to a revolutionary weapon: the submarine. The U-boat was small, stealthy, and deadly. It could strike unseen, vanish beneath the waves, and disrupt Allied shipping with terrifying efficiency. Yet submarine warfare presented a profound dilemma. Traditional naval rules required warning civilian vessels and ensuring the safety of passengers. Submarines, fragile when surfaced, could not realistically follow such rules without risking destruction. By early 1915, German U-boats had already sunk dozens of ships around the British Isles. In February, Germany declared the waters surrounding Britain and Ireland a war zone. Enemy vessels entering these waters, the announcement warned, were liable to destruction. Even neutral ships were not guaranteed safety. The message was unmistakable and public. Newspapers in Europe and the United States reported the warning widely. Shipping companies were aware of the risks, governments understood the implications, and yet transatlantic travel continued. The Lusitania was scheduled to sail from New York to Liverpool on May 1, 1915. On the very day of departure, the German embassy in Washington placed a warning notice in American newspapers. The advertisement reminded travelers that Germany considered the waters around Britain a war zone, and that ships flying the British flag could be destroyed. The warning appeared directly beneath advertisements for the Lusitania's voyage. Despite this, nearly 2,000 passengers and crew boarded the ship. Among them were 128 American citizens. The United States was officially neutral, and President Woodrow Wilson had repeatedly warned Germany that attacks on American lives would carry serious consequences. German leaders knew that sinking a ship full of Americans could shift U.S. public opinion decisively toward war. British leaders knew this as well. This reality lies at the heart of the Lusitania enigma. Officially, the Lusitania was a civilian passenger liner. Unofficially, she carried cargo that complicated her status. Records would later reveal that the ship's manifest included millions of rounds of rifle ammunition and other war-related materials. Under British law, this was legal. Under German interpretation, it transformed the ship into a legitimate military target. The British Admiralty was fully aware of the growing U-boat threat. By 1915, British naval intelligence had begun intercepting and partially decoding German communications. Submarine movements, patrol zones, and operational intentions were increasingly known, at least in fragments. Yet this intelligence was closely guarded. Revealing its existence risked exposing Britain's code-breaking capabilities. Here the questions begin to multiply. Why was the Lusitania not provided with a naval escort as she approached the most dangerous waters near Ireland? Why was she instructed to reduce speed due to fog despite submarines being most effective against slower targets. Why were zigzag maneuvers, standard anti-submarine practice, not strictly enforced? Some contemporaries believed the answers were simple: overconfidence. Others argued that resources were stretched thin and escorts were unavailable. But critics, both then and now, have suggested something far more disturbing. At the time, Winston Churchill served as First Lord of the Admiralty. A visionary and aggressive strategist, Churchill believed that war should be fought decisively and without hesitation. In private correspondence, he acknowledged that incidents involving neutral ships could influence American opinion. He also understood that a dramatic German violation of civilian life might achieve what diplomacy could not. This does not mean necessarily that Churchill or the Admiralty deliberately sacrificed the Lusitania. But it does raise an uncomfortable possibility: that the risk to the ship was knowingly accepted. Passengers aboard the Lusitania were largely unaware of these calculations. Life on board was calm, even cheerful. Meals were served, children played on deck, and conversations revolved around homecomings and futures beyond the war. The Atlantic crossing, though tense, still felt routine to many. Beneath this calm surface, however, the ship was sailing through a convergence of intelligence failures, political ambition, and military experimentation. The Lusitania was no longer just a passenger liner. She had become a symbol, a test case for the brutal logic of modern war. To determine whether the Allies knew the Lusitania would be sunk, one must first accept a sobering truth. By 1915, civilian lives were already entangled in strategic calculations. The boundaries between military necessity and moral responsibility were eroding rapidly. The Lusitania sailed on, unaware that history had already marked her.
As the Lusitania left the safety of New York Harbor and began her eastward journey across the Atlantic, she carried with her not only passengers and cargo, but also the weight of mounting intelligence reports, diplomatic tensions, and unspoken assumptions. By May 1915, the war at sea had entered a dangerous new phase, and both Britain and Germany understood that a single incident could alter the course of history. In London, the British Admiralty was receiving a steady stream of reports concerning German submarine activity. Naval patrols, merchant captains, and intelligence officers all contributed fragments of information that painted a troubling picture. U-boats were operating aggressively along the approaches to the British Isles, particularly off the southern coast of Ireland. This area, a vital corridor for transatlantic shipping, had become one of the most perilous zones in the world. British intelligence had achieved a quiet but significant breakthrough through intercepted wireless transmissions and early code-breaking efforts. The Admiralty possessed partial insight into German naval movements. While the intelligence was incomplete and often delayed, it was sufficient to indicate that submarines were active precisely in the waters the Lusitania would soon enter. This intelligence advantage, however, came with a heavy burden. Revealing that Britain could read German signals risked alerting the enemy and destroying a priceless strategic asset. As a result, intelligence was often acted upon indirectly or not at all. Merchant ships were warned in vague terms. Routes were adjusted without explanation, and in some cases, ships were left to rely on general precautions rather than specific warnings. The Lusitania received no explicit alert that a submarine lay in her path. Captain William Thomas Turner, an experienced and respected officer, was aware of the general danger. He had been instructed to maintain high speed and to follow anti-submarine measures when approaching hostile waters. Yet the guidance he received was inconsistent. One message emphasized speed as protection. Another warned of poor visibility and advised caution. The lack of clear, unified direction reflected the Admiralty's own uncertainty. On my says, as the Lusitania neared the Irish coast, the situation grew more ominous. Multiple ships reported submarine sightings in the area. Some vessels were sunk within Dizand, even hours of the Lusitania's arrival. These reports reached British naval authorities, reinforcing the reality that U-boats were actively hunting in the region. Still, no destroyer escort was dispatched to meet the liner. The absence of an escort has long been one of the most controversial aspects of the disaster. British destroyers were available in nearby ports. Escorting slow merchant ships was standard practice in high-risk zones. Yet the Lusitania, one of the most valuable and high-profile vessels afloat, was left to sail alone. Some historians argue that the Admiralty believed an escort would draw attention to the ship. or that it would be wasted on a liner thought capable of defending herself through speed alone. Others suggest that the decision reflected deeper strategic priorities. Protecting troop transports and military cargo took precedence over civilian vessels, regardless of their symbolic importance. Another factor complicating the situation was secrecy. If the Lusitania were given special protection, German observers might suspect that the British knew something specific, perhaps too specific, in a war increasingly defined by intelligence and counterintelligence. Even defensive measures could reveal hidden advantages. Meanwhile, German submarine commanders operated under their own constraints. Capit. Lieutenant Walther Schweiger, commanding U-20, had already sunk several ships during his patrol. He was running low on torpedoes and fuel, yet determined to strike valuable targets. The German Navy had instructed U-boat captains to attack enemy shipping in the declared war zone, though the legal and moral implications of such attacks remained hotly debated. Schweiger had no knowledge of the political storm that would follow an attack on a ship carrying American civilians. He saw only silhouettes through his periscope and made decisions in seconds, decisions shaped by orders, training, and survival. On board the Lusitania, the atmosphere remained deceptively calm. Captain Turner reduced speed slightly due to fog and altered course toward Liverpool. The ship did not zigzag consistently, a maneuver that could have complicated a submarine's firing solution. Whether this was due to overconfidence, confusion, or conflicting orders remains unclear. What is clear is that multiple layers of warning failed to converge into decisive action. The Admiralty knew submarines were present. German warnings had been issued publicly. Intelligence hinted at imminent danger, and yet the Lusitania sailed into the war zone without escort, without explicit warning, and without maximum defensive measures. This convergence of missed signals has fueled speculation for more than a century. Did British leaders assume that Germany would not dare attack such a prominent liner, especially with Americans aboard? Did they believe the political cost to Germany would be too high, or did they calculate consciously or unconsciously that if such an attack occurred, it would serve a larger strategic purpose? There is no single document that proves deliberate sacrifice. No order exists stating that the Lusitania should be exposed to danger. But history is rarely shaped by explicit commands alone. Often it is shaped by what is not said, what is delayed, and what is allowed to happen. As the Lusitania approached the old head of Kinsale on the afternoon of May 7, 1915, she was sailing through one of the most heavily patrolled submarine zones in the Atlantic. Beneath the waves, U-20 lay in wait. In that final hour, the gap between what was known and what was done closed rapidly. The consequences would be immediate, devastating, and irreversible. The Lusitania had become more than a ship at sea. She was now a test of modern warfare, intelligence, ethics, and political calculation. The answer to whether the Allies knew she would be sunk may never be absolute, but the evidence suggests they knew she was in grave danger. What followed would shock the world. By 1915, the First World War had evolved into a conflict not only of armies and navies, but of information. Beneath the visible battles lay a hidden war of codes, intercepted messages, and secret reports, one that would profoundly shape the fate of the Lusitania. To understand whether the Allies knew what was coming, one must enter this shadowy world of intelligence and silent decision. At the heart of British naval intelligence was a highly secretive unit known as Room 40. Established shortly after the outbreak of war, Room 40 was responsible for intercepting and deciphering German wireless communications through a combination of captured codebooks, skilled linguists, and early cryptographic techniques. The British gained an unprecedented glimpse into German naval operations. This intelligence was imperfect, fragmented, and often delayed, but it was real. Messages intercepted by Room 40 revealed patterns of U-boat patrols, operational zones, and strategic intentions. While the exact position of any given submarine was rarely known with precision, the Admiralty could identify areas of heightened risk. By late April and early May 1915, these reports increasingly pointed to the waters south of Ireland as a focal point of German submarine activity. The Lusitania's route led directly through this danger zone. The challenge facing British leaders was immense. Intelligence, by its nature, demanded secrecy. If Britain altered ship movements too precisely or too frequently based on intercepted messages, Germany would quickly realize that its codes had been compromised. The loss of this intelligence advantage could cost countless lives and ships in the long term. Thus, Intelligence was often used selectively or not at all. This created a moral and strategic paradox. The Admiralty possessed knowledge that could potentially save individual ships, yet acting on that knowledge risked losing a tool that could save many more in the future. In this calculus, individual vessels even prestigious ones could become expendable. Whether the Lusitania fell victim to this logic remains one of the most disturbing possibilities in modern military history. Internal Admiralty communications reveal a mindset shaped by cold realism. The war was not expected to be short. Submarine warfare was intensifying. Britain needed the United States not yet as a military ally, but at least as a sympathetic neutral. German attacks on civilians, especially Americans, threatened to shift public opinion across the Atlantic. Some British officials privately acknowledged this dynamic. While no document explicitly calls for sacrificing civilian lives, there is evidence of an awareness that German excesses could serve British interests. In this sense, the Lusitania occupied a dangerous intersection between military risk and political opportunity. The Germans, meanwhile, believed they were fighting a defensive war at sea. The British blockade was slowly strangling Germany's civilian population, leading to food shortages and mounting unrest. From Berlin's perspective, unrestricted submarine warfare was a necessary response to an illegal and inhumane blockade. German intelligence was far weaker than Britain's. U-boat commanders operated with limited information, relying on visual identification and standing orders. Captain Lieutenant Walter Schwieger of U-20 had no knowledge of Room 40, no awareness of British intelligence capabilities, and no understanding of the political symbolism attached to the Lusitania beyond her identity as a large British liner. When Schwieger encountered the Lusitania, he was acting within the framework of his orders and the brutal logic of submarine warfare. Back in Britain, the Admiralty continued to downplay the risks publicly. Shipping companies reassured passengers. The Cunard Line emphasized the speed and safety of its liners. No effort was made to discourage civilians, especially Americans, from traveling aboard British ships, despite the growing danger. This, too, raises questions. If the risk was truly understood, why were stronger warnings not issued? Why were passengers not advised to postpone travel or choose neutral vessels? One possible answer lies in economic necessity. Transatlantic travel and trade were vital to Britain's war economy. Another lies in psychology. Acknowledging extreme danger could cause panic and disrupt morale. But a darker interpretation persists that civilian presence aboard ships like the Lusitania was seen as a form of protection. The assumption was that Germany would not dare attack a vessel carrying neutral passengers. In this sense, civilians became unwitting shields. This assumption would prove tragically wrong. As intelligence reports accumulated, decisions were made, avoided behind closed doors. No dramatic meeting sealed the Lusitania's fate. No single individual can be blamed. Instead, a series of small, cautious, and arguably rational choices combined to produce catastrophic results. The Lusitania was allowed to sail. Escorts were withheld. Warnings remained general. Speed was trusted. Political consequences were weighed, if only subconsciously. When viewed in isolation, each decision can be defended. When viewed together, they form a pattern of calculated risk. By the time the Lusitania entered the final stretch of her journey, intelligence officers, naval strategists, and political leaders all possessed fragments of a truth that no one fully confronted. The ship was sailing into extreme danger, and the consequences of her loss could reshape the war. What remained uncertain was not whether disaster was possible, but whether anyone would intervene to prevent it. That question would be answered on the afternoon of May 7th, 1915. The morning of May 7th, 1915, dawned calm over the Irish Sea. The Lusitania, steaming steadily toward Liverpool, was still largely unaware of the danger lurking beneath the waves. From London to Washington, behind closed doors, governments and intelligence services were wrestling with questions of risk, responsibility, and consequence. One of the most controversial aspects of the Lusitania tragedy is the suggestion that British leaders may have knowingly accepted or even encouraged the risk of her sinking. To understand this, it is necessary to consider the political and military context. Britain's position was delicate. The nation faced the enormous challenge of sustaining a war effort on multiple fronts. Naval superiority was both a strategic asset and a necessity for survival. Civilian and merchant shipping was critical for supplies, but each voyage across submarine-infested waters carried immense danger. The Admiralty was under pressure to protect vital military assets while preserving the appearance of control and security. Intelligence from Room 40 revealed U-boat deployments, but precise targeting remained uncertain. The Admiralty could predict areas of risk, yet it could not guarantee the safety of any particular ship. This uncertainty created an ethical dilemma. To what extent should civilian shipping be exposed to potential attack in order to achieve larger strategic objectives? Some historians argue that British leaders viewed the Lusitania as a potential catalyst. An attack on a high-profile ship carrying American citizens could generate international outrage, potentially swaying U.S. public opinion toward eventual involvement in the war. From this perspective, the risk was not merely tolerated, it was implicitly recognized as having potential utility. No official documents endorsed the deliberate sacrifice of civilian lives, yet private correspondence and internal memos suggest a conscious awareness of the danger and its possible political ramifications. Decisions made to avoid a treflec, a hierarchy of priorities. National security and long-term strategic gain often outweighed the immediate protection of individuals. Captain William Thomas Turner, aboard the Lusitania, understood the growing submarine threat but was constrained by orders, ship schedules, and a lack of clear guidance. He attempted to follow standard anti-submarine procedures, but inconsistencies in Admiralty directives limited his options. Even the speed and maneuverability of the Lusitania, considered a protective factor, could not guarantee survival against a well-placed torpedo. In Germany, Captain Lieutenant Walter Schwieger was unaware of the broader political implications. He observed the liner, identified it as British, and acted according to the rules of engagement. Torpedo ready. Target acquired. Attack executed. From Schwieger's perspective, this was a military operation, a strike against enemy shipping in a declared war zone. The collision of these decisions, knowledge and uncertainty, action and inaction, created a scenario ripe for catastrophe. The Lusitania became a convergence point for intelligence, politics, and wartime morality. No one individual orchestrated the disaster, yet the cumulative effect of human choices, both conscious and negligent, made it inevitable. The question remains, did the Allies know the Lusitania would be sunk? Perhaps not with absolute certainty, yet they knew she faced extraordinary danger. They possessed partial intelligence indicating U-boat presence, and they made decisions that left the ship exposed. In strategic terms, they calculated that the potential political and military gains outweighed the risk. In human terms, the consequences would be devastating. By the afternoon of May 7th, U-20 was in position near the old head of King. Schwieger's periscope spotted the Lusitania. Within minutes, the torpedo struck. The explosion tore through the hull, igniting munitions stored in the cargo and sending the luxury liner to the bottom of the sea within 18 minutes. The loss was catastrophic. 1,198 passengers and crew perished, including 128 Americans. Shockwaves spread across Europe and the United States, fueling outrage, political debate, and propaganda campaigns. The world had witnessed the deadly intersection of modern naval technology, intelligence warfare, and human calculation. Historians continue to debate the Allies' knowledge and intent. Some argue that the Admiralty's decisions were the result of misjudgment and overconfidence. Others suggest that, while not overtly seeking the ship's destruction, British leaders were aware of the risk and tacitly accepted it in pursuit of strategic advantage. The sinking of the Lusitania thus stands as a defining moment in the moral calculus of modern warfare. It illustrates how intelligence, politics, and human decision-making can converge to create disaster. The ship's fate was shaped not by a single hand, but by a chain of choices, some deliberate, some negligent, that together produced one of the most infamous tragedies of the First World War. The event also set the stage for dramatic geopolitical consequences. American public opinion, previously neutral, shifted toward sympathy for the Allies. Diplomatic tensions with Germany escalated, and the war at sea entered a new, more lethal phase, where civilian and military lines would increasingly blur. Ultimately, the Lusitania serves as a sobering case study in the ethics of intelligence, risk assessment, and wartime decisions. Its sinking was not a simple accident, nor was it a straightforward act of sabotage. It was the outcome of a complex web of knowledge, calculation, and human error, an enigma that continues to challenge historians and moral thinkers alike. The morning of May 7, 1915, began like any other aboard the RMS Lusitania. The Atlantic waters shimmered under a pale spring sun, and a gentle breeze moved across the decks. Passengers lingered over breakfast, children played near the promenade, and crew members carried out routine duties with professional precision. Few could imagine that in a matter of hours, their world would transform into chaos and tragedy. Captain William Thomas Turner, an experienced seafarer with decades at sea, had grown increasingly aware of the risks surrounding the ship. Submarine activity near the southern coast of Ireland had been reported in fragmented intelligence, yet the exact locations of German U-boats remained uncertain. Turner's decisions reflected a delicate balance: maintain speed to reduce vulnerability, yet navigate carefully through foggy waters near the Irish coast. The Lusitania's passengers were largely unaware of these dangers. American tourists, British citizens returning home, and travelers from around the globe engaged in conversation, attended lectures, and strolled along the decks, confident in the ship's reputation for safety. In their eyes, the vessel's luxury, speed, and modern engineering were sufficient protection against any threat. Beneath this calm surface, however, events were converging toward catastrophe. Hermann Saborino 20, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Walter Schwieger, had maneuvered into position near the old head of Kinsel. Schwieger had been on patrol for weeks, seeking valuable targets in the war zone declared by Germany months earlier. His mission was straightforward: disrupt enemy shipping by sinking British vessels, especially those carrying supplies or strategic cargo. Civilian casualties were an anticipated consequence, but the political ramifications, particularly involving American passengers, were largely unknown to him. The strategic environment of the Atlantic at this moment was a deadly chessboard. U-boat movements, British intelligence, and Admiralty directives intersected in ways few could predict, while Room 40 in London monitored German transmissions. The Admiralty's internal communications revealed caution, concern, and, in some cases, overconfidence. Orders emphasized speed and anti-submarine maneuvers, yet no escort vessels were dispatched. The assumption that the Lusitania could outrun potential threats proved tragically optimistic. As the ship approached the Irish coastline, the weather and sea conditions were calm but deceptive. Visibility was limited by intermittent fog, a factor that complicated navigation and anti-submarine defense. Captain Turner followed standard protocols, maintaining course while advising vigilance among the crew. Crew members stationed lookouts along the decks, scanning for any signs of submarines, floating mines, or suspicious objects. The tension was subtle but present. Professional intuition whispered of danger, even as passengers remained unaware. Meanwhile, U-20 lay submerged beneath the waves, tracking the liner's progress. Schwieger's submarine was a marvel of stealth for its time, capable of approaching without detection, armed with torpedoes that could annihilate even the largest ships, and operated by a disciplined and trained crew. For Schwieger, the encounter with the Lusitania represented both opportunity and necessity. Every decision carried weight. Conserve torpedoes or strike decisively. Risk exposure on the surface or attack from submerged stealth. Adhere strictly to orders or adapt tactically. At precisely 2:10 p.m., the U-20 fired a single torpedo at the Lusitania. The impact was catastrophic. The torpedo struck on the starboard side, detonating near a hold that contained munitions and cargo destined for the war effort. The initial explosion tore through the hull, producing a column of fire, smoke, and shrapnel that immediately engulfed nearby decks. Passengers who had moments before enjoyed leisure were thrown into confusion and terror. Chaos spread rapidly. Crew members attempted to deploy lifeboats, but the sudden list of the ship, coupled with panic, made organized evacuation nearly impossible. Children were separated from parents, travelers were trapped by debris, and many passengers, unfamiliar with emergency protocols, struggled to comprehend the scale of the disaster. Smoke and flames from the cargo intensified the fire, adding to the confusion and accelerating the sinking. The ship's engineering staff worked frantically to contain flooding and maintain power, but the damage was overwhelming. Within minutes, critical compartments flooded, extinguishing engines and lights. The Lusitania's rapid sinking jamir. 18 minutes after the torpedo struck left. Little time for organized rescue. Nearby vessels and coast guards rushed to respond, but the speed and magnitude of the disaster limited their effectiveness. Survivors clung to lifeboats, floating debris, and each other as waves of panic and grief swept across the Atlantic. The water was cold, the currents strong, and the loss of life mounting with each passing moment. Among the passengers were notable figures, ordinary families, and American citizens whose deaths would amplify political consequences. Their presence aboard the Lusitania ensured that the sinking would resonate far beyond the immediate tragedy. Newspapers in the United States reported the event with horror, highlighting the deaths of civilians, particularly Americans. Public outrage began to build, laying the foundation for a shift in opinion that would influence America's eventual entry into the war. The human toll was staggering. 1,198 lives lost, including men, women, and children. The wreck left behind stories of heroism, survival, and unimaginable loss. Captain Turner survived, as did Schweiger. But the survivors' accounts would form the core of historical records that continue to be studied and debated. The sinking of the Lusitania was not only a maritime disaster, but a turning point in public perception of modern warfare. It exposed the lethal intersection of technology, strategy, and human judgment. It revealed how intelligence, decision-making, and risk assessment could produce outcomes far beyond what any individual intended. In retrospect, the final voyage highlights both the capabilities and limitations of wartime knowledge. British intelligence had warnings and indications. German commanders acted with precision within their orders. The ship's crew followed established protocols, yet the convergence of circumstances, choices, and incomplete information created a tragedy that neither side fully anticipated in its human consequences. The Lusitania's sinking thus embodies the complexity of modern war, an event shaped as much by what was known and ignored as by the direct action of torpedoes and crews. It serves as a cautionary tale about the ethical and strategic dilemmas that arise when civilian and military spheres collide. The moment the torpedo struck the Lusitania, the ship transformed from a symbol of luxury into a vessel of terror. The explosion ripped through the starboard hull with deafening force, sending steel and debris into the air and igniting a fire that raced along the decks. Panic surged through the passengers like a tidal wave. The calm, orderly atmosphere of the morning was gone in an instant. Crew members trained for emergencies tried to maintain order, but the speed of the sinking rendered most organized efforts impossible. Lifeboats were lowered haphazardly, often into the path of falling debris or amidst the panicked passengers. Some boats capsized, throwing those aboard into the cold waters of the Atlantic. Others were launched with insufficient crew, leaving passengers to fend for themselves. Children were separated from parents, and families were torn apart within seconds. The fire from the torpedo's explosion ignited cargo holds containing munitions and other war supplies. Flames spread rapidly through wooden fittings and furniture, adding smoke and heat to the terror. The combination of structural damage, fire, and chaos meant that the Lusitania's descent was unusually swift. In only 18 minutes, she slipped beneath the waves, leaving debris, floating luggage, and the screams of hundreds behind. Survivors clung desperately to floating objects. Some managed to reach lifeboats, while others were rescued by nearby vessels rushing to the scene. The Irish coast was only a few miles away, but the cold Atlantic waters claimed many lives before help could arrive. Hypothermia, exhaustion, and injuries contributed to the mounting death toll. On the shore, news of the disaster spread rapidly. Local rescuers and coast guards worked tirelessly, pulling survivors from the water. Hospitals in nearby towns were overwhelmed with injured passengers, many of whom suffered severe burns, broken bones, or shock. Communities along the Irish coast became impromptu relief centers, providing clothing, food, and care to those rescued. The sheer scale of human suffering left an indelible mark on the region and on the survivors themselves. Across the Atlantic, the sinking of the Lusitania reverberated immediately in public and political spheres. Newspapers in the United States carried dramatic headlines emphasizing the deaths of American citizens. Families mourned the loss of loved ones. An outrage toward Germany mounted. Wilson's administration faced increasing pressure to respond, balancing neutrality with calls for justice. In Britain, the Admiralty was faced with a delicate situation. The loss of a major passenger liner with nearly 1,200 lives was a public relations disaster. Yet it also reinforced the need for strict enforcement of the blockade and continued naval operations. Internally, debates raged about whether more could have been done to protect the Lusitania from escorting the ship to issuing more explicit warnings to passengers. Historians continue to examine the details of that final voyage, scrutinizing every decision made aboard the ship and within the Admiralty. Did Captain Turner have enough information to take alternative measures? Could the Admiralty have deployed destroyers or rerouted the ship? Was the risk of American outrage anticipated, or was it a secondary concern? In Germany, the consequences of Schwieger's actions were largely tactical. U-20 returned to port, and the attack was seen within naval circles as a successful engagement. Yet the political repercussions were immense. Germany had underestimated the impact on U.S. public opinion, which began to shift toward support for the Allies. The propaganda potential of the tragedy was enormous, and both sides quickly exploited the event to further their own narratives. Among survivors, stories of heroism and selflessness emerged. Passengers helped each other into lifeboats. Sailors risked their lives to save strangers, and communities along the Irish coast provided rapid aid. These acts contrasted starkly with the mechanical, impersonal nature of the attack, highlighting the human dimension amidst technological warfare. The Lusitania's sinking was more than a single maritime disaster. It was a turning point in public perception of the First World War. For the United States, it demonstrated that neutrality was fragile and that the realities of modern conflict could reach across oceans and borders. For Britain, it exposed the limitations of maritime intelligence and the moral ambiguities of wartime decisions. For Germany, it marked the beginning of international condemnation and a recognition that submarine warfare carried political as well as military consequences. The tragedy left a legacy that persists to this day. The debate over whether the Allies knew the ship was at risk, and whether they could have done more to prevent disaster, continues to fuel historical inquiry. The Lusitania remains a symbol of the complex interplay between intelligence, strategy, and human cost, a stark reminder that in modern warfare, decisions made in offices thousands of miles away can have lethal consequences on the open sea. In the aftermath, survivors returned home carrying the memory of chaos, loss, and heroism. Families mourned, communities remembered, and nations debated responsibility. The Lusitania sank into history, not only as a ship, but as an enduring enigma, a case study in risk, ethics, and the unforeseen consequences of global conflict. The sinking of the Lusitania sent shockwaves across the globe, reshaping perceptions of the First World War and raising profound questions about morality, strategy, and international law. Within hours, newspapers in London, New York, and Berlin reported the disaster, each framing it according to national interest, political agenda, and emotional impact. The tragedy became a battlefield of information, propaganda, and public opinion on arena as decisive as any at sea. In Britain, government officials understood the potential power of the event. The loss of a luxury passenger liner, with nearly 1,200 lives, including 128 Americans, could be framed as an example of German ruthlessness. Posters and newspaper articles highlighted the horror and cruelty of the attack, emphasizing civilian deaths and the violation of international norms. The British public, already accustomed to reports of military casualties, reacted with shock at the vulnerability of civilians far from the front lines. The Admiralty, while cautious about revealing intelligence sources, allowed carefully curated information to circulate. German warnings about war zones, the presence of ammunition aboard the ship, and the political calculations behind shipping routes were downplayed or omitted. Instead, the narrative focused on German aggression and the innocence of the passengers. This selective presentation amplified outrage and positioned Britain as a victim of unprovoked violence. Across the Atlantic, the effect was even more pronounced. In the United States, newspapers covered the event extensively, emphasizing the American casualties and the dramatic circumstances of the sinking. Headlines screamed of murder on the high seas and civilian massacre by German submarines, capturing the imagination and indignation of the public. Editorials debated the proper response, weighing neutrality against the moral imperative to act. President Woodrow Wilson, committed to neutrality at the time, faced intense pressure. Diplomats in Washington conveyed outrage from families, businesses, and political figures. Wilson condemned the attack in carefully measured language, calling on Germany to respect the rights of neutral citizens while avoiding immediate military engagement. Letters from grieving families poured into the White House, humanizing the statistics and adding emotional weight to the political discourse. In Germany, the sinking was initially hailed as a tactical success. U-boat commanders were praised for their efficiency, and Naval Command regarded the attack as consistent with the logic of submarine warfare. Yet Berlin quickly realized the political cost. International outrage, particularly in the United States, risked drawing a powerful neutral nation into the conflict. Germany's carefully calculated campaign of maritime disruption had created unintended consequences. Propaganda efforts intensified on both sides. Britain used the disaster to strengthen recruitment, justify military expenditures, and frame the war as a fight for justice and civilization. Germany attempted to defend its actions as legitimate warfare, emphasizing the blockade's threat and the presence of munitions aboard the ship. Each narrative sought to shape perception, influence morale, and control the historical record. Public reaction was equally complex. Families mourned, survivors recounted harrowing experiences, and ordinary citizens debated culpability. The Lusitania became a symbol of the human cost of modern war, a tangible reminder that technology, intelligence, and political calculation could converge to produce unprecedented tragedy. Discussions of ethics, morality, and strategy permeated newspapers, political speeches, and private correspondence alike. The political consequences extended beyond immediate outrage. In Britain, the disaster reinforced commitment to aggressive naval measures, while intensifying scrutiny of Admiralty decisions and intelligence operations. In the United States, the event began a gradual shift in public opinion, laying the groundwork for future involvement in the conflict. Debate over the moral legitimacy of submarine warfare and civilian risk dominated diplomatic discussions. Historians analyzing the sinking emphasized the complex interplay of communication, secrecy, and perception. British and American authorities had partial knowledge of submarine activity. German commanders followed orders based on strategic necessity. Civilians were caught in the intersection of these forces. The tragedy illustrates the difficulty of assigning responsibility in a world where knowledge is fragmented, decisions are constrained, and consequences unfold unpredictably. The Lusitania's loss also sparked legal and ethical questions. Was it lawful to transport munitions alongside civilians? Could a ship's speed and prestige justify exposure to known risks? Did intelligence agencies have an obligation to warn passengers explicitly? Each of these questions reverberates in the historical debate, reflecting tensions between military necessity, diplomacy, and human morality. Ultimately, the disaster served as a lens through which the world examined the rules of modern warfare. Civilian vulnerability, submarine strategy, and the power of propaganda all intersected in the story of the Lusitania. The event became a case study in the limits of foresight, the consequences of human calculation, and the enduring challenge of moral clarity during total war. Over a century after the sinking of the Lusitania, historians, naval strategists, and moral philosophers continue to grapple with the questions it raised. Was the disaster an inevitable consequence of modern warfare, a tragic miscalculation, or a deliberate risk accepted for strategic gain? The answers remain contested, and the complexity of the events ensures that debate will endure. One of the central points of controversy concerns the knowledge and decisions of the British Admiralty. Records indicate that intelligence had been gathered regarding German submarine deployments near the southern coast of Ireland. Room 40, Britain's cryptographic unit, intercepted messages indicating U-boat activity, although these were often fragmented and sometimes delayed. Admiralty communications reveal a mixture of caution and confidence, as officials weighed the risk to individual ships against the broader strategic picture. Some scholars argue that the Lusitania's route and lack of escort demonstrate negligence. Others suggest that the Admiralty acted prudently within the constraints of available resources and intelligence. The presence of munitions aboard the Lusitania adds another layer of complexity. While the ship was officially a civilian passenger liner, evidence suggests she carried significant quantities of rifle cartridges and possibly other military supplies. This dual status blurred the line between civilian and military target. For Germany, the carriage of munitions justified the attack under their interpretation of international law. For Britain, it raised questions about the morality of exposing civilians to risk in support of wartime logistics. Captain William Thomas Turner's decisions during the voyage have also been scrutinized. Some argue he should have taken greater precautions, such as more aggressive zigzagging or speed adjustments, while others emphasize the limited options available given conflicting orders, environmental conditions, and passenger safety concerns. Turner survived the disaster, and his testimony became a key source for inquiries. offering insights into both the human and operational challenges faced during the sinking. German responsibility is equally debated. Captain Lieutenant Walther Schwieger operated under orders to attack enemy shipping in the declared war zone. U-20's actions were consistent with those orders and the strategic objectives of the German Navy. Yet the disproportionate human toll, including the deaths of neutral civilians, highlights the tension between military necessity and ethical considerations. Germany's subsequent diplomatic efforts, including offers of compensation and attempts to justify the attack, were largely unsuccessful in mitigating international condemnation. The role of American citizens aboard the Lusitania had significant geopolitical consequences. Two deaths of 128 Americans shifted public opinion, creating moral pressure on President Woodrow Wilson's administration. While the United States remained neutral at the time, the tragedy made clear that neutrality was increasingly untenable in a world where technology enabled distant conflicts to reach even neutral nations. The Lusitania thus became a catalyst, demonstrating how human and political consequences intersect with military strategy. Propaganda and media coverage amplified the historical debate. British and American newspapers emphasized German aggression, civilian victimization, and the heroic efforts of crew and rescuers. Germany's attempts to frame the attack as lawful were largely ignored outside German-speaking nations. Over time, these narratives shaped public memory and historical interpretation, influencing both contemporary policy and later scholarship. Modern historians continue to analyze the Lusitania as a case study in intelligence, decision-making, and risk. Was the ship deliberately exposed to danger for political gain? Perhaps not explicitly. Did the Admiralty recognize the risk and choose to act with calculated restraint? Likely. Could more have been done to prevent the loss of life? Almost certainly. The tragedy illustrates the limitations of foresight, the challenges of wartime ethics, and the consequences of fragmented knowledge. The Lusitania also highlights broader issues about the evolution of warfare. Submarines introduced new dynamics in naval conflict, where speed, stealth, and intelligence could determine outcomes in ways unimaginable a generation earlier. Civilian vulnerability became a central concern, challenging established norms and forcing nations to reconsider rules of engagement, international law, and the protection of non-combatants. These debates persist in modern military ethics and policy discussions, from submarine operations to drone warfare. Ultimately, the Lusitania sinking remains both a historical event and a moral enigma. It serves as a reminder of how technology, intelligence, political calculation, and human decisions converge to produce outcomes that are tragic, unpredictable, and deeply consequential. Scholars, students, and strategists continue to study the incident, drawing lessons about responsibility, foresight, and the costs of war. In the end, the question may not be whether the Allies knew the ship would be sunk, but rather how human judgment, incomplete information, and strategic priorities combined to allow one of the most infamous maritime tragedies in history. The Lusitania rests at the bottom of the Atlantic, a silent witness to the convergence of war, politics, and human choice. Its story, a cautionary tale that resonates even in the 21st century.